there is a very rigorous process that those drug manufacturers have to follow. And typically it looks a little bit like this. There are essentially 6 major sections or stages between a vaccine or a drug going from development all the way to being approved and then becoming available for consumers. And those stages or phases here are listed here. So you have the R&D, which essentially means the research and discovery stage. And that means that the scientists are looking at, in laboratory settings, they're doing all their research to just figure out what type of condition are we trying to treat or prevent, right? And they're trying to just figure out what type of drug could be helpful. If they find something that they like that could be useful, they start to test it. And they first begin testing that in non-humans, right? And if things go well in that stages and there's no alarms, they will advance it to human type of testing. When they get to human studies, that's really broken down into 3 different stages or phases 1, 2, and 3. As those manufacturers are studying it in phase 1, things, they have a green light, things look good, they'll move on to phase 2, and then, so forth, phase 3. As they advance and from phase 1 going on to phase 3, those studies, they get more and more rigorous, they get larger. There's a lot more things that they're doing as part of those studies to make sure that they are getting their questions answered. After they conclude their phase 3, their largest studies, then they package that information up into an application for the FDA to review. And the FDA will rigorously evaluate that information before they make a decision if they should approve it and make it available for consumers. This entire process here, as you can see, is sequential. That means you cannot advance until the previous stage has concluded and we got our questions answered from the previous stage and things look okay. They look good, right? So it's sequential. Next slide, please. But when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccines, right, many of you or maybe have heard about or have your own thoughts around, well, it happened a little too fast, happened a little too quickly. Something was different, something was rushed, right? In fact, it feels like we actually started much further along on this continuum. We just jumped right into those human studies, and then suddenly it got approved. Next slide, please. But the reality is, we didn't start that far along. We actually started very close to actually the very, very beginning of these steps. And let me just explain to you all why it feels like one thing, but the actual reality is different. Next slide, please. The first thing is understanding what happens in an emergency use authorization. What makes the drug or vaccine development process different during an emergency use authorization? Well, instead of those sequential steps that we talked about, during an EUA or emergency use authorization, the drug manufacturers and vaccine manufacturers are allowed to do all of these steps kind of on a side-by-side basis. They're happening concurrently rather than sequentially. So for example, I know this figure is a little small here, it's hard to see, but on the left-hand side of this figure, you're seeing 2 major bubbles happening side by side. One of them is the vaccine production process, the mass production process is happening at the exact same time as they were performing their studies, okay, for their human studies. That's important because normally vaccine manufacturers cannot start doing mass production until they've already received FDA approval. But during an emergency use authorization, like in a pandemic, having that mass production happening side by side is important to make sure that we get that vaccine available as soon as it's approved. It also is important to recognize that, one of the things that is true and that we hear about is that when vaccines or medications or drugs are being developed, it takes years, right? As many of you heard that, it takes many, many years. One of the reasons why it takes so long is actually not this process necessarily. It's because those researchers and investigators spend a lot of time effort and resources in trying to recruit people to participate in their studies. That takes actually the most amount of effort, and that's why it takes so long, years, to understand, to have a study and make sure that that study has enough people so that you get your questions answered. In the case of these COVID-19 vaccines and in their studies, we didn't have to recruit very much because we have people volunteering, knocking at the door. We actually had a surplus of people willing to participate in these studies. And so that meant that that long timeline also was shortened because of that. And so that's important to understand because not only are we having processes happening side by side, but we're also having volunteers to participate in the study to speed up the process. All right, before we go on to the next slide, I also want to highlight that in the case of the COVID-19 vaccines, and we'll touch base on this on subsequent slides, but we didn't have to start from scratch. We actually had lots of information about these COVID-19 vaccine, or the vaccine technology already available to us. And so because of that, that helped jumpstart the process for getting this vaccine studied quickly. Next slide, please. And so let's talk about some of that information, okay? First of all, Pfizer, Moderna are two types of vaccines that both utilize what's called mRNA technology, mRNA. These two vaccines are also vaccines that require 2 doses in order to complete the series. Those 2 doses are usually separated by about a month apart, depending on which vaccine you get. Okay. The Pfizer vaccine is approved right now for people who are 16 years and older. And the Moderna vaccine is approved right now for people who are 18 years and over. The Janssen vaccine is different in that it is not an mRNA vaccine. And it's different in that the current recommendation is just 1 dose to complete the series. No need to get a second dose at this time. So let's talk a little bit more, dive in a little bit deeper around these mRNA vaccines. One of the other things I hear about often from people I talk to is, I don't want to get this COVID-19 vaccine because it's too new. We've never had this type of drug before, vaccine before, right? And there is truth to that. It's certainly true that the mRNA vaccines are the first types of mRNA vaccines that have come to market. Come to market meaning it's available to the public, right? But they're actually not the first types of vaccines, mRNA vaccines, that were studied. In fact, mRNA vaccines have been studied, studying the vaccine mRNAs have been studied going back since 2017. But that mRNA technology and how that's been used actually dates back a couple of decades. But as far as the way it's been utilized in vaccines, it goes back to 2017. In fact, that type of technology is being used to study the development of vaccines for rabies, influenza, Zika, cytomegalovirus. But we haven't heard about this. We have not heard about this, right, for even these other 4 infections. And the reason why is because we have medications for these conditions. We have other vaccines for some of these conditions already, okay? So there's no urgency to bring it to market. So they're really taking their time with these types of vaccines. But when the pandemic hit, the same investigators that are developing these mRNA vaccines for these conditions stopped and switched gears. They started to focus just on the COVID-19 vaccines and took all the information that they learned and that they built to develop vaccines for these and immediately applied it to the COVID-19 vaccines. That helped jumpstart where we started, basically, with the COVID-19 vaccines. Next slide, please. So a little bit more on the mRNA vaccines. Okay, I want to highlight, not just like with the ingredients that are in these mRNA vaccines, but also help people conceptualize how they're able to do this. If I can just get a raise of hands, are we all familiar with the game of Jenga? Yeah, a couple of no's. So a game in Jenga involves little blocks that are stacked together, right? There's typically it's 3 blocks that are stacked together, and you create a tower with those blocks. And if you can imagine that each of those little tiny blocks that you use to make that tower are individual genes that code for proteins and our body parts, right? Imagine the entire stack of blocks is the entire genome, or DNA, if you will, for the virus, okay? And every individual little block is a specific gene to build something, a component of that virus, okay? You need all the blocks to play Jenga. You need all those blocks to have a real virus, right? But what these investigators have done, or these researchers, is they found a way to remove just one of those blocks, right? And they removed just one of those blocks. And they used that block to develop this COVID-19 vaccine, okay? And that's that mRNA that you see there, okay? It's one of those blocks. Now, the way, mRNA itself is really unstable. Unstable in the sense that it breaks down very quickly into basic building blocks, okay? So to help stabilize it, to help protect it, they combine it with some buffers and some enzymes that are very typical in vaccines and in many medications already. And they combine it there, and they also use this fat bubble to protect it. The fat bubble is like the shield to protect the mRNA on the inside as well. The other important component of that fat bubble around the mRNA is that it helps it get delivered into the body. Okay, so those are really important ingredients that actually serve a purpose for protecting the mRNA. What you notice here, there's actually no eggs that were used to develop these vaccines. There's no eggs in the vaccines, no egg proteins, no nut proteins, no SOFA, no antibiotics, no preservatives, no tracking devices, no chips, okay? None of that, no latex, right? These are all things that people often talk about because they may have allergies to, right? But these vaccines have very simple ingredients. Right, next slide, please. So let me just talk a little bit more about mRNA. So I gave you that analogy with Jenga blocks, right? But that's not just unique. mRNA is not just unique to the virus. As humans, we have mRNA in our bodies right now. We have mRNA that's involved in every single body function. Without mRNA, we wouldn't be able to make our own proteins. We wouldn't be able to make our own enzymes. So mRNA is a very familiar type of biomolecule in our bodies. Okay, it's involved in every process, every millisecond of time. mRNA, the M in RNA stands for messenger, which basically means it's like providing instructions to make and build a protein. I think as DNA as being your cookbook, and mRNA as being one of those recipes in your cookbook, okay? So that's what that is. And that recipe is very unique to make a very specific type of protein. One mRNA for one type of protein, okay? That's how special it is. It's very, very specific. So the mRNA in this vaccine, or in general, I should say, it instructs to build a very unique type of protein that's unique to that mRNA. Once mRNA has served its purpose by telling your body what kind of protein to make, that mRNA again breaks down into its natural building blocks and then gets recycled. Next slide, please. the Janssen vaccine works a little differently. Okay, it's not considered an mRNA vaccine. Instead, it doesn't use the same technology. So we talked about the fat bubble that helps the mRNA vaccines, protects the mRNA and deliver the vaccine. Instead of having that same fat bubble, it has what we call a viral, it's called a viral vector vaccine. It basically, instead of that fat bubble, you have a viral shell that protects and serves the same purpose. It helps deliver the same genetic material and protects the genetic material in the vaccine. This virus shell is not a real virus in the sense that it doesn't grow. It's not the coronavirus. It doesn't replicate. It has no other information to actually do anything. Its only purpose is to deliver the vaccine, and then it breaks down into its basic building blocks. I think of this virus shell as a lot like, sometimes my analogies are not very good, so forgive me. But if you think of a snail, okay? If you remove the slug out of the snail, all you have is a shell, right? And it still offers protection for whatever you put in there, but it's not a real snail if it's just the shell, right? That's a lot like this viral vector technology, okay? Next, thank you. Like the mRNA vaccines, we do have history and experience with this type of technology, the Janssen technology. In fact, the Janssen vaccine technology has been around since the 1970s, right? So a long time. In fact, just like the mRNA vaccines, this vaccine technology has been used to develop vaccines for other types of infections as well, right? Malaria, influenza, HIV, Zika, Ebola. In fact, this technology was most recently used to make and be used during the most recent Ebola outbreaks. Some of that which is still going on in parts of the world, right? So again, very familiar technology, and we have good experience with that already. At the end of the day, all 3 COVID vaccines ultimately do the same thing. So even though Janssen vaccine has different technology than the mRNA vaccines, once those vaccines enter the body, it sends the same instructions to the body to make the same exact type of protein. We call that the spike protein. Okay, so the genetic material that gets delivered tells your body to make this spike protein. This spike protein is unique to the virus that causes COVID-19. The body doesn't have any other instructions to make any other parts of the virus, which means after receiving the vaccine, it's not possible to have a real infection, which means it's not possible to have live virus as a result of receiving the vaccine. Okay, so the vaccine does not provide, it's not a real virus. Okay, excuse me. The genetic material that is used in these COVID-19 vaccines also don't affect our DNA. It doesn't alter our DNA. It doesn't interfere with the DNA. In fact, our DNA is, like if we think about our cells, even within our cells, we have another bubble inside of our cells called the nucleus. That's where the DNA lives. The DNA lives in a protected bubble called the nucleus inside of a cell. mRNA, like the genetic material like mRNA, doesn't enter that protective bubble in the nucleus. So it doesn't actually affect or come close to even interacting with our DNA. All right, so I want to also help folks understand and conceptualize why vaccines work in the first place, like why COVID-19 vaccines, like their purpose, right? Oh, I guess we skipped a slide. Let me do this one first. At the end of the day, again, for the bottom line for the Janssen vaccine, we know it's made differently, but regardless of how they're made, it gives the same instruction to make the same protein in the body to help you fight the virus that causes COVID-19. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so I just want to take a second to pause and just recap what we've learned so far. We talked about the development process and helped provide information that highlights that these vaccines were made fast, right? They were made fast, but they were not rushed. No corners were skipped, right? We had this, the process was allowed to happen side by side, concurrently, rather than sequentially, which helps us make these vaccines available faster to us. mRNA is available is familiar to our bodies already. In fact, mRNA is not unique to humans, it's not unique to viruses. Bacteria also use mRNA. It's part of life. We all have it. And the vaccines and the genetic material in them does not interfere or interact with the DNA, with our human DNA. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to transition a little bit, and I'm just going to highlight some things about the clinical trials that I think it's helpful for people to have this information. I also want to take a step back and say that I believe Sabrina will be able to, either I'll provide a link to Sabrina, but we have a recording of this presentation. And so we'll ask Sabrina to share it for anybody. I see some folks taking some notes, and so I want to make sure that you all have access to that recording too. All right, so as far as the clinical trial information, one of the things that I quickly wanted to look at and survey is what is the racial and ethnic representation in the studies for COVID-19 vaccines, which I think is really important to understand. And I'm going to start with the Janssen vaccine in a second, but in comparison, I also wanted to see how does that compare to our U.S. population, our racial and ethnic breakdown in the U.S. population. So when I compared those numbers side by side to the U.S. population, Janssen, actually all three are very, very closely aligned to the U.S. population. But just to highlight, for example, the Janssen study, which was actually a study that was done in multiple parts of the world, not just the U.S., but the numbers here you see are specifically reflecting the racial and ethnic breakdown in the U.S. population. In the Janssen study, we saw 74% of participants were identified as white, which compares to about 76% of the U.S. population. 13% identified as black or African American, which compares to about 13.4%, so almost exactly the same. And as far as people identifying as Asian, 7% in the Janssen study, and a little less than that in the US population. When it comes to people who are Hispanic or Latinx, 14% in the Janssen population, or Janssen study, and 18% in the US population, right? So what you see that if you continue to look and survey the Moderna and the Pfizer study, what you see is there is some significant similarities, right? Basically stating that our studies actually did a good job in reflecting the US population. And in fact, in my career so far, this is one of the things that really excited me because I have not seen as much diversity in a vaccine study as I did with this COVID-19 vaccine studies. And so that really excited me. Next slide, please. The other thing I looked at is, among the people who are included in these studies, how many among them are considered to be high risk for having severe illness if they were to get COVID-19? And what we notice is that about 50% of all people in all these studies were people among the high-risk population. So that meant that they're either over the age of 65 or maybe they even have medical conditions that put them at high risk. Some examples of those high-risk medical conditions are listed there too: serious heart disease, diabetes, obesity, COPD, stable HIV, are just examples among a list of many types of conditions. But the most important thing here is about half of the study populations were considered to be high risk, which is important because the intent of vaccines is to protect all persons, but also to protect the people who are most likely to have severe illness. Next slide, please. So with that said, the big question, how well do these vaccines work? Right? How well do they work? And I think that it's important to acknowledge that wherever we read or hear media, news, friends, family, whatever, there's a lot of numbers that are thrown around, and it's really confusing, right? So I want to try to simplify this as much as possible, but that the way these studies evaluate how well they work, they do that in different ways. The first thing is they want to know, after getting the vaccines, if somebody were to get infected with the virus, how many of them, have mild disease, how many of them have moderate disease, how many of them have severe disease, right? And they turn that into a number to figure out the effectiveness of these vaccines. For the Janssen vaccine, when it comes to preventing any type of symptomatic disease, from mild to severe, for the Janssen vaccine, after 28 days, the effectiveness was calculated to be 72%. For mRNA vaccines, okay, the Pfizer, Moderna, they both say their data indicated that their effectiveness was about 95%. Okay, I have two thoughts about this. One, it's very natural. We have this natural urge to want to compare these two numbers, 74% compared to 95%, right? But we can't do that, and I want to tell you why in a second. Also, 72% for any type of vaccine is also really, really good. Really good. There are some vaccines, like the polio vaccine, for example. I can't remember the exact percentage of effectiveness in this moment, but it was somewhere like less than 50%. And that helped eradicate polio in the US, right? So using that as an example, 72% is still really, really good. But back to my original point. Naturally, we want to compare these numbers, but we should not. Let me tell you why. When the pandemic, the emergency declaration related to this pandemic started like end of February, early March. Pfizer and Moderna immediately started to plan their vaccine strategy, their development, their studies, and that type of thing. They were able to launch their first study around April, May, June, early summer of 2020, okay? During that time, we didn't know anything about variants. We hadn't identified any variants. At that time, virus was circulating and it was very concerning, but we hadn't really experienced a surge. Remember at that time they were saying, oh, by summer it's gonna go away, right? Oh, by summer it's gonna go away, right? It didn't, right? But that the virus circulating, we weren't really in the type of surge that we experienced later on that year, right? The Janssen study, they weren't able to start studying that until September of 2020. What happened around that time? We had already discovered variants. We had much more virus circulating in the community. We were in the middle of a surge, okay? So the environments in which these vaccines were studied are just very different. I would say that Janssen had a harder time because there was more virus circulating and because there were more variants circulating, right? So the conditions were not apples to apples, right? So we can't compare them because of that. Next slide, please. All right. And those numbers reflected, again, preventing any symptomatic disease. But as I mentioned before, the investigators also looked at severe illness that would require hospitalization, right? And all three vaccines independently, right, found that their vaccines help protect people from becoming severely ill, nearly 100%, all three of them, okay? And again, this is related to preventing severe disease that would otherwise require hospitalization. Next slide, please. So because of this, part of our messaging and helping people understand is that all 3 vaccines have nearly 100% protection against causing, the virus causing severe disease that would otherwise cause hospitalization. This is one of the reasons why we say that there is no vaccine that is truly second best or third best. Right? We can't pay attention to that number 72% and compare it to that 95%. We can't do that. So this is one of the reasons why we say that the best vaccine for you is the one that's available to you when it's available and when you're able to get it, right? Now, more on how well do these vaccines work, I also want to highlight that in the Janssen vaccine studies, they went to multiple countries. It wasn't just a US-based study. Moderna and Pfizer were mostly US-based. The Janssen vaccine took it a step further. They studied their vaccine in South Africa and Brazil, 2 places where there were variants already identified, right? The P1 variant in Brazil and the B113 from South Africa. And so I think they were smart about that because they had that knowledge, right? They said, let's go there. We want to know is it going to work in those environments. And so when they finished their study, they wrapped it up, and they finished their evaluation, their analysis. They found that preventing 100% of severe illness that would require hospitalization meant there's also protection against these variants. So that 100% protection against hospitalization is also from these variants, from these other regions of the world. So that's also something important to keep in mind. Thank you. So to summarize that, Janssen has high effectiveness against those existing variants. The mRNA vaccines, again, they weren't studied. They didn't know that at the time. So they didn't know that that was a question they needed to answer. But now they're trying to answer that question, right? And in fact, Pfizer just released a new study that found that it is protective against the South African variants. And more and more, as time goes on, we're seeing more and more emerging data that both mRNA vaccines are also providing protection. But researchers are going to follow this story a little further because they really want to know what the full impact will be. Okay, so we know some things now, but we want to know more. All right. So why is there this focus on variants? Well, we have some already here, right? There are some that are already circulating in the community. But it's important to understand why variants form in the first place, okay? Variants are basically viruses that adapt, they change, right? I guess an analogy might be, for humans, maybe dyeing your hair, right, a different color, or maybe changing the texture, or maybe just putting on a different pair of pants or clothes or shorts, right? All that changes something about the way you look, right? Variants are the exact same way, or the viruses do the exact same thing. They change the proteins on the outside of the shell, okay? Like the way we might put on a new coat, right? So that's what variants are. Now, variants are allowed to form when they're given the opportunity to grow, okay, to grow in the body. Variants form when we allow the virus to spread in the community. Variants grow when the virus is allowed to just go unchecked, right? So the vaccines are a really important tool because vaccines are going to help lower the risk of any new variant from forming in the first place. Okay, so right now we are on, clinically, we are on a race, right, to get as many vaccines into people's arms because that's going to help reduce the risk of any new variants from forming. One of the big questions is, will we need booster shots in the future? Will we need to get this vaccine? Will this turn into like the flu vaccine, right? Needing to get it every year. The answer is we don't know, but the answer will be yes if we give this virus more opportunity to form new variants, okay? So that's kind of where we are right now, if that's helpful to know. All right, more on how well do vaccines work. As I mentioned, we focus on people becoming symptomatic with if they were to get the virus after getting the vaccine. But there's also something to be said about people who never develop symptoms after getting the virus, right? In fact, around last summer, we know that about 40% of new infections, people never develop symptoms. But yet, people who have the virus and who are asymptomatic are a key group of people that are spreading the virus because they don't know that they have it, right? So a big key question for us is how well do the vaccines work in people who never develop symptoms in the first place? And our emerging data is really suggesting strongly that there is a reduction in asymptomatic infections. Okay, there is a reduction, which is key. Okay, it's there's multiple parts to this equation, but this is one of them. There's some indication that the vaccines actually help if you were to get the virus after getting the vaccines. Okay, let me turn off this alarm real quick. If you were to get the virus after getting a vaccine, then we know that the vaccine itself neutralizes the virus. What I mean by that is it attacks it quickly so that it doesn't have a chance to grow in the body. That means lower viral load. And when you have lower viral load, that means that there's lower risk of new variants from forming because it can't grow very quickly or very well. It also means the spread of the virus decreases. Next slide, please. So I say all that to mean, to set some realistic expectations around what vaccines do, right? No vaccine, first of all, is 100% effective, okay? No vaccine is a virus repellent. Vaccines are not meant to work like mosquito repellents, okay? Vaccines don't put this magical shield around us that prevent the virus from entering, okay? So that means that even after getting the vaccine, the virus is still going to be circulating. The virus can still touch us. The virus can still get into our bodies, right? But if that were to happen after you're fully vaccinated, one of the most important things is you don't get severely sick, right? Yeah, you don't get severely sick. And all 3 vaccines, again, are 100% effective at preventing severe illness that would otherwise require hospitalization. Okay. If we go back one more slide, there we go. Thank you. This also reminds me to highlight that vaccines are an additional tool we have to combat this pandemic, right? But there are some very fundamental differences on what vaccines do for us versus what PPE, like our masks, do for us, or physical distancing, washing hands. Okay, there are some fundamental differences, and those are that wearing masks, physical distancing, washing our hands frequently, help us prevent the spread of new infections of the virus. It also helps prevent us from getting infected, right? The predominant benefit of getting vaccinated is if that virus were to enter you, you just wouldn't get severely sick, right? So virus protects you from getting severely sick, and the mask and all that prevents you from getting the infection in the first place, right? So the two go hand in hand. They don't replace each other. Next slide, please. Will vaccines make me sick? As I mentioned, that it's not, because the vaccines only instruct our bodies to make one particular protein of the virus, that spike protein, and nothing else, it's not possible to get a real infection as a result of receiving the vaccine. it's not possible to, the vaccines themselves are not delivering a live virus. But your body is going to be tricked into thinking there is an invader, right? It's going to fight off that spike protein that's generated from the vaccine, thinking it is the real virus, right? And because of that, what it's going to do is, or what you can expect is that side effects can happen, right? And we'll talk more about side effects, but if they were to happen, the onset of those side effects typically happen within a day or two, and they can last a day or two, right? Next slide, please. So let's talk about some of those side effects, and there's gonna be a lot of numbers on the next few slides, and so I'll try to get through this without confusing you with all the numbers. But the side effects that happen as a result of just getting the shot, which is typically in the arm, okay? The most common types of side effects that happen is a sore arm, right? It is a sore arm. That is normal, okay? In fact, over 75% of people experience a sore arm with the Moderna or the Pfizer vaccine. Next slide, please. As far as other side effects, more systems side effects, the type of spectrum of side effects that occur or can occur are low-grade fever, feeling tired or fatigued, having a headache, muscle aches, joint aches, chills, or vomiting. Those are all possible types of side effects, and they do happen in a good portion of the people who get vaccinated. I mean, to me, 15% of people experiencing joint aches is pretty significant, okay? But that's not the most common type of side effect that could occur with these vaccines. With the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, as I mentioned, it requires 2 doses to complete its series. What we do notice is that people, after their second dose, okay, typically get more side effects, or they feel them more compared to the first time around, okay? That is also common, and there's an explanation for that. After your first dose of the vaccine, your body starts to build up antibodies. It starts to build up immunity, right? So when you get your second dose, that's going to really activate your immune system to really want to fight it off, okay? So because of that, it's possible to feel these side effects a little more than the first dose. Next slide, please. But what does that mean for the Janssen vaccine, right? This is also one of those things that's different about the Janssen vaccine, in that overall there's less side effects with the Janssen vaccine. And overall meaning in terms of the frequency of these side effects are less, but also the intensity, or how strong they feel, is also less compared to the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine. But the spectrum of side effects is the same, okay? And even though I say that overall side effects are less, again, what do you see? You still see 15%, 30%, right? They're still common, even with the Janssen vaccine. So overall less, but they're still common. And so we want people to expect them to happen regardless of what vaccines they receive. That way you can create a plan for caring for yourself in case you don't feel very well, okay? Next slide. All right, when it comes to more severe reactions with the vaccines, severe reactions have occurred in less than 0.001% of all people who have been vaccinated. In fact, in California, we've vaccinated millions of people so far, millions of people, and there's been no new safety concerns about these vaccines. Still, the FDA is charged with wanting to make sure that they understand the full side effect and the full severe reactions that could occur, that might occur, right? They're going to want to check to see what the rarest of rare reactions are, right? So they're going to want to, they're following this a lot more closely. Next slide, please. All right, so let's pause and just recap what we've found out so far. So in our studies, we know that, I forgot to mention again that in all 3 studies, Moderna, Pfizer, and Janssen, there were tens of thousands of people involved in their studies. In fact, for the Pfizer and Janssen vaccine, it was about 43,000 people in their studies. And in the Moderna, it was like 35,000, so a lot of people. We also know that the racial and ethnic demographics closely align with the US-based demographics. Again, just demonstrating that there's adequate diversity represented in them as well. About half the participants were high risk, and that side effects, again, should be expected. And part of our plan after receiving a dose is making sure we just plan to rest, plan to drink plenty of fluids. In the most part, we don't typically see people having to change their routines. Okay, we don't typically we see that happening, even in people who experience the side effects. But still expect to rest anyway, drink plenty of fluids. Vaccines overall have been safe, both in my personal experience so far vaccinating individuals, but also just following the trends within this state and nationally. Nothing new, alarming that is being generated with the millions and millions of people we've been vaccinating so far. Next slide, please. Even though we've had some studies and I've cited some things and where I've received some of my information, it doesn't stop there. There's a lot more studies still ongoing because we want to know more. We're a little greedy for more and more information right now at this time, right? There is a 2-dose regimen for Janssen that's being studied, and so the current recommendation is just 1 dose. But it's possible that after this study, that new recommendations can be generated. We don't know yet, but they're investigating that. There's always questions about boosters again, right? So lots of those studies going on, but also studies more focused, on youth and adolescents. How does vaccinations work, and how well do they work in youth and adolescents? How well do they work in pregnancy or breastfeeding moms, right? Those are more focused studies that we want to look into, and also for people who are immunocompromised, right? Be because they have conditions or they take medicines, right? We want to further understand. We know that people who are immunocompromised were included in the studies already, but we want to know even more. And so that's the intent of that study. Next slide, please. All right, will the vaccine make me test positive for COVID-19? The answer to that is no. Remember that this vaccine is not delivering live virus, okay? Those those uncomfortable nose swab tests, those types of tests look for active infection, okay? Those tests also look for a very specific type of protein from the virus that tells us there's an active infection. That protein is very different than the protein that the vaccines help your body make, that spike protein, okay? So they're just completely different proteins, and there's no way for them to cross-react. Next slide, please. Can I still get infected after getting the vaccine? The answer is yes, right? We said that these vaccines are not virus repellents, right? So it is still possible, but that these vaccines protect you. So if that were to happen, you can feel comforted in knowing you wouldn't be getting severely sick. Next slide, please. Should I get the vaccine even if I've tested positive in the past? The answer is yes. Right? We want people to get vaccinated even when they've had the virus in the past. A couple reasons for that. One, the immune response that is generated from a real infection, we don't really know how long that immunity lasts. And so getting the vaccine can be really helpful in boosting that immunity, okay, for the first part. The second thing is, as variants are kind of circulating, it is possible to get reinfected with the virus. In fact, there's cases of that too, right? And so vaccination can help protect from that as well. Next slide, please. So how long does immunity last after receiving the COVID-19 vaccine? Right, well, the studies stopped after 3 months. And after 3 months, it was very clear that we had a robust response at 3 months, okay? But they stopped. So the question was, well, what happens after that, right? And Pfizer and a couple of other smaller studies that came out, but for Pfizer specifically, they did an additional 6-month study and found that after 6 months, the response was still robust, right? So we haven't, the reality is we haven't had these vaccines that long, right, to really know what that long-term immunity looks like. But so far, everything looks really good. The other thing I want to highlight about this is, the question I ask myself is, what kind of biological, like the immune response that we have in our bodies, what does that actually look like compared to vaccines that have been proven to have long-term, decades, years of immunity, right? And what we notice with these 3 vaccines is it produces an immune response that not just generates antibodies, but it generates a memory and it puts it in a memory bank in our bodies. And that process looks identical to vaccines that we already have and are using that generate long-term immunity on the scale of years. Okay, years. So that makes me really hopeful that we are going to see that. Okay, but still, we don't have years of experience with them yet, right? So our investigators and researchers are still going to want to understand and follow that to really know its full impact. But I'm hopeful because of that there will be long-term immunity. All right. What happens if I miss my second dose? So this is relevant to the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine, the 2-dose series, right? It happens. Things come up. I can't make my second dose, right? Well, it's okay. Just get it when you can. Get it as soon as possible, okay? Even if you have to get it outside of the recommended window, right? So for example, Moderna, 4 weeks after you get your first dose is when you're eligible to get your second dose. But they want you to get it within 4 to 6 weeks from your first dose. So if those 6 weeks pass, it's okay to get it 2 months, 3 months, okay? You just want to get it as soon as possible because by not getting that second dose, you're not being fully immunized, you're not fully protected, so you're just delaying full protection. So you want to get it as soon as you can. Next slide, please. Should I stop wearing a mask after getting the COVID-19 vaccine? Not yet. Not yet, especially in public places, right? Not yet. Remember, we talked about the fundamental differences, what masks do, what vaccines do. But also, we still want to better understand the full impact of these vaccines and what they mean for us. But we're also only at 20% in the US, only 20%, about 20 to 22% of our adult population is currently fully immunized. We have a long way to go, so we're not quite there yet, but we're hopeful that we will get to this place. Next slide, please. But what can I do after I get vaccinated? What is different, right? This is a big question. In fact, this information is available on the CDC website. And I've talked to folks about this, and I hear some things that are not quite right with the way that this information is interpreted. So I want to highlight a couple of things here. Per the CDC, if you are fully vaccinated, you can gather in a private indoor setting with other people who are also fully vaccinated and don't have to wear a mask. Okay, so if all people in there are fully vaccinated, you do not have to wear a mask. So what does fully vaccinated mean? If one person received the Moderna or Pfizer vaccine, that means 2 weeks after they receive their second dose. 2 weeks after, okay? For the Janssen vaccine, that's 2 weeks after the Janssen vaccine as well. So you have to remember that by receiving a vaccine, it doesn't work immediately. It takes time for your body to build that immunity. So 2 weeks after the second dose or 2 weeks after Janssen is when you're considered fully vaccinated. Next slide. All right, so you can also gather in a private indoor setting with unvaccinated people from one other household. Okay, from one other household. Okay? And you don't have to wear a mask. And if you're fully vaccinated and you are exposed to somebody who has an active infection, then you never develop symptoms. So if you're fully vaccinated and you were exposed to someone with the virus, okay, as long as you never develop symptoms, you do not need to quarantine. Okay, so that's what the CDC says. Next slide. But these do not apply in certain situations. None of this applies in certain situations. And those situations are that anytime there is a setting where there's like group living happening or congregate living, none of this applies. It doesn't apply if you're gathering with unvaccinated people from more than one household, right? Because basically we don't want more than one household who are unvaccinated coming together en masse, right? It also doesn't apply in any situation where anybody else in that room is considered high risk over the age of 65 or who have those medical conditions, because we still want to protect them, okay? Next slide. Oh, there you go. The CDC also says that we should continue to avoid medium and large gatherings. We should continue to exercise physical distancing. We should continue to wear our masks and use all the hand hygiene. But we also should be following the guidelines that are related to the workplace, that are related to the local governments, the state, right? So remember, the CDC is just one body, but these other entities might have other policies or guidelines that we also have to follow. Next slide. All right, so I did mention some information about vaccines and pregnancy and breastfeeding moms. Just to quickly recap, they're going to be studying this further. We don't know, there are some registries that are involved to further understand this, but that we do know from our experience now that these vaccines are not causing infertility either, which is, I think, really key in messaging as well. Next slide. All right, I only have a couple more slides left here, and these are elements of an effective vaccine conversation. I like to make sure that I honor and respect everybody's opinions and experiences and thoughts about these COVID-19 vaccines. And so this information was put together to help us have those effective conversations, either with among peers, among loved ones, families, clients, like whatever it is, right? But always start from a place of empathy and understanding. I like to assume that everyone wants to be vaccinated, but that people are going to have questions. People have questions before they make that official decision, right? Providing your strong recommendation, right? This is the reason why I got vaccinated. This is the reason why they got vaccinated. Sharing that, I think, is also really helpful. Addressing misinformation and by sharing some key facts. Many of those key facts is what informed this presentation today. So a lot of the things we went over are those key facts you would want to reiterate. Next slide. And listen. Listen, 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 because people have things to say about this, right? People have things to say, and in those conversations, there are questions, right? So listen. Proactively explain the possibility of side effects. Again, expect them. Right? We showed a few slides that sore arm, over 75% of people, right? Just expect them. They may not happen. It's too hard to predict who gets what. There's a good number of people who never develop side effects, but there's a good number of people that do. So just expect them. And keep the doors open. Remember that having conversations like this, it's not about convincing somebody, right? It's not convincing a loved one, a family member, a peer, ourselves, right? It's being open to these conversations, and if somebody that you're talking to isn't ready to make a decision, invite those conversations back when they do have another question that they want to share with you. All right, with that said, I think I'm out of material, and I want to open it up for reflections and Q&A.
So when you said that people should go around with other people that have been vaccinated, so I mean, how do you determine that?
Yeah, that's the hard part, because it is something that's private, right? So oftentimes that is information that is shared voluntarily, and is often among people who are family, right? And so family members that have all been vaccinated can start to come together, and sometimes that is voluntarily disclosed among those circles. But I absolutely think that's right. Like, this is a private thing, that it's a medical decision that people are making for themselves, right? And we shouldn't be asking invasive questions about their vaccine status. But if it voluntarily comes up, that you're comforted in knowing that as long as all people are vaccinated in that environment, that you can enjoy each other's company without needing to wear a mask. Yeah. Any question here?
Thank you, Dr. Gomez, for the information that you have given us as to the apprehension of what's needed for our bodies to affect. I have three statements here. One is, I thank you for the two answers that you give me, which dealt with the RNA and the DNA as to the covalent balance, the bonding effect, as to that bubble, how it bonds, the bonding effect. And also, too, thank you for the trial periods that they're going into, the study dates and all that, because it's very important that we understand that there's studies being done. Mm-hmm. And the question that I have is dealing with the blood types that I noticed that I didn't see a presentation on, as to the effects of the percentage levels that 95%, 73%, and some other percentages of people that, even though they had the protein, that they were affected. Mm-hmm. And I didn't see a blood type, mm-hmm. A case study. And also, too, I didn't see, which is carbon data, as to the carbon that goes into the lungs that causes that problem of clogging. I didn't see that data either. I do appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, I think those are really good questions. I too have not seen any type of data on blood types. Blood type A, B, right? And what that means for their experience for receiving vaccines. I will say that with our millions of people that have been vaccinated, I'm pretty confident that we've had a wide diversity of all blood types who have received them, but that I don't have very specific data that would be able to answer those types of questions. And then your second question about the carbon load. So these vaccines are not generating, or not injecting any new carbon loads that would clog our lungs. In fact, by administering these vaccines into an arm, we're triggering our immune response that happens. It starts off as a silent response, and to generate the antibodies. And that response itself does not generate any new carbon material that would clog the lungs. Now, people who have history of having a shortness of breath reactions from medications or other vaccines or something like that, in those types of situations, they could be more sensitive to the effects of these vaccines, where they might express some discomfort in breathing. It happens in a very small percentage of people, but it's something to acknowledge that, in those types of people, my recommendation would be for them to get vaccines in a health facility rather than a community pod site like a school or wherever else. Like, you want to get that in a health facility just in case something happens. But that I haven't seen any increased risk of enhancing carbon-related harm to the lungs of recipients. Yep.
You know, there is a high percentage of carbon cars,
Yeah.
industry, and all this that's going on. And I don't know the percentage level as to the air, but I know that dealing with elements of the air, there's about 1,600 different elements in the air
Yeah.
that have a continuance of problems that could be as to manufacturing things.
Yeah.
So therefore, carbon, I know that's kind of influxed in the world, is a big problem, the ozones and all the
Yeah.
rest of that. So why is it not statistics done as to the breathing of carbon being tested?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I think that the answer, the initial questions that the investigators want to answer with these COVID-19 vaccines is, does it prevent people from dying from COVID? Does it prevent people from getting severely sick? And to answer those questions, I don't think they were thinking about the impact of carbon. But I think that the bigger question here for me is this idea of carbon emissions that relate to the manufacturing process of vaccines and what that impact is on the global carbon footprint. And many of these drug, I don't know these ones specifically, but many of them, and I would bet to say that these are involved in actually neutralizing or having neutral effects on carbon emissions as part of their manufacturing productions. But that's, again, there's no specific data that says that related to recipients of the vaccine. Yeah.
Any other questions? This. You have them? Yes, the children, yeah.
So during the first session, we had a question from Sister Rosa, and it was mainly about what the impact of children have on spreading the vaccine. So, Doctor, if you can address that question, that would be great.
Yeah, that was a really good question, too. So we know that youth in general have been a big part of this equation of spreading infections. And the reason why I say that is because youth, children, young adults are among people who, if they get COVID, that they don't have symptoms. They're asymptomatic. And so they never develop symptoms. And if they were to get tested, for adults, getting tested is already very uncomfortable. And for youth, it could be quite traumatic for them as well. Right? So when we're thinking about how youth interact with each other around, care centers, schools, right? Those are key places that are causing the virus to spread, right? So we know that vaccinating youth and adolescents are part of the solution to decrease the spread of the virus, right? And to that end, there is emphasis in getting those groups vaccinated. Now, when the 3 manufacturers of these vaccines were launching their studies, they did not include children or youth below the age of 16, but they are now. In fact, there's 2 studies ongoing right now. One that started, one that's ongoing, that is specifically looking at youth and the impact of these vaccines in youth. And so we'll have answers to that very soon. But that they are definitely part of this solution to help end this pandemic.
And then we had a question regarding not mixing vaccines, the brands.
That's right. So it's also a really good question. So if the current recommendation right now is to stick with the same vaccine. So if you got Moderna, stick with Moderna for your second shot. If you got Pfizer, stick with Pfizer to get your second shot. And that reminds me to say that know what you got. If you get a vaccine, you're going to get a CDC card that indicates what type of vaccine you received. It's important to store that card, remember that card, but also know what vaccine you got. Because when you go to get your second shot, check the immunizer. Whoever is there preparing it, ask them, what vaccine is that? right? Just double check to make sure you're getting the right vaccine for your second dose. Mixing and matching is not something that is recommended, so stick with what you got. They are investigating the whole mixing and matching right now, but we don't want to introduce that in the real world right now.
And then lastly, you mentioned the conspiracies and the historical drama around African Americans not wanting to participate in receiving vaccines. If you could address that also.
Yeah, so I think that the big key there is to acknowledge the historical trauma, right? That's very real. And I think that part of our work is helping to keep those conversations and doors open for talking about COVID-19 vaccines, providing factual information about these vaccines, and doing what we're doing here today. We're delivering information to help somebody make a decision for themselves, right? It should not be, it's never my intent to convince somebody that they need to get the vaccines, but to help guide them to make a decision that's best for them, right? And with the historical trauma and vaccine hesitancy that exists among Black and African American communities, among other communities of color, it's true. We need to be patient, right? It could take time, and that's okay, right? Getting somebody vaccinated 3 months from now, 6 months from now, is still better than none, right? And we don't want to introduce more trauma among the healthcare system, among getting vaccines, among care that we should be receiving, that would, cause long-term consequences for that person's health, right? So, yeah, I think we should be having these conversations openly and not pressuring anybody, and helping them make those decisions, supporting them in whatever way we can.
And lastly, just the definition, the terms variance and efficacy, just to explain what the variants are and what efficacy and effectiveness, what they are.
Yeah, I think I was a little too confusing in my response last time. So I may have used the word efficacy, or you may have see the word efficacy on the slides. Efficacy basically means the same thing as effectiveness. So when I say they were looking at efficacy, investigating the efficacy of the virus of the vaccine, I mean the effectiveness of the vaccines. And then for variants, I really think about variants as, again, as just being a different color of the original form of whatever it is that we're talking about, right? So in the case of the virus, it might be a virus with a slightly different protein, and the analogy to humans is wearing a different coat, right? Wearing a different mask. We put on a different mask every day, right? That would be a version of a variant, yeah, but it's the same person, right? So I think there's one question up here. Can we bring a mic? There we go.
Hello, and thank you once again for informing us. My question is, would we have a choice in which vaccine that we can request, which you have presented all three, based on if you have underlying conditions? Can you base which one you would like to have?
That's a good question. So based on someone's health conditions or age or something like that, there's no reason that one vaccine would be better than the other, but that absolutely you all have a choice in which vaccine you would prefer. Now, at the place that you go to, if you choose to get a vaccine, the place that you go to, they may not have all three. They might not even have two of the three, right? And so it's important to acknowledge that sometimes they disclose it ahead of time. This is the vaccine we're offering at this event. And so when you make an appointment, you know what vaccine you're planning on getting. But it's also possible that they don't have that information up front because, unfortunately, vaccine supply is it's getting more predictable, but it's been a little unpredictable for the most sense. But the right vaccine will be the one you can get. And if you know of a place that you can get an appointment to that has the vaccine that you would prefer, absolutely do that. Mhm.
Okay. As Pastor Hope always says, was this a good investment of your time? Well, Dr. Seth, we want to thank you for taking the time out of your Saturday to come and inform us. I think the information that he provided was somewhat beneficial, do you guys think? Great, great. Well, I think that's all we have if there's no other questions. I do want to invite you guys to go into our kitchen. We do have some refreshments inside the kitchen. Healthy snacks is what we have inside the kitchen. So please feel free to stop by our kitchen and pick up a healthy snack on your way out. And again, thank you guys for RSVPing and then showing up today. And I hope to see you guys tomorrow for Resurrection Sunday. All right, God bless you guys.
Thank you, everyone.